I'm bored. Hello? Boy? Oh no! It's the suggestion monster! I can't do that. I don't have a Super Nintendo. Stop asking for Super Nintendo reviews. Nightmare Creatures? I can do that. The PS1 version? Have you seen any of my videos? Alright, the N64 version it is. And I'll compare it to Shadow Man. Go away. You smell awful. Welcome to Versus Mini, a miniature version of my series Versus. Basically, in my regular Versus, I talk about 5 or 6 different categories when comparing games, but this series will be more focused on 1 or 2, basically whichever categories I think are most important for the games that are being discussed. I also get a lot of Versus requests, and this series will let me work on some of those Versus that I don't want to dedicate a whole 30 minutes to. Today's video is Nightmare Creatures vs. Shadow Man. Let's get into it. Every time I ask people what games they want me to compare, I always get 3 requests: Banjo-Tooie vs. Donkey Kong 64, Snowboard Kids vs. 1080 Snowboarding, and Nightmare Creatures vs... well, people really want me to compare Nightmare Creatures to something. Nightmare Creatures vs. Resident Evil 2 vs. Castlevania vs. Shadow Man. Nightmare Creatures vs. something. But today I wanted to go ahead and tackle Nightmare Creatures vs. Shadow Man and discuss which game has better horror elements, because it's that time of the year. These elements don't necessarily determine the better game, but I thought that it'd be fun to talk about. Today I will discuss how these two games use their presentation to create scary experiences. Okay, first off, I don't think either one of these games are terrifying necessarily. I also wouldn't argue that either game is meant to be scary all the way through. Wait up. Wait right there. Give me 1 second. Nightmare Creatures is pretty much just a beat 'em up with a horror skin slapped on top, but when it comes to the design of the game, nothing really scary. In fact, there's an element in Nightmare Creatures from a design standpoint that makes the game very unscary and removes all the tension. I'll explain in a bit. Shadow Man is pretty much just an exploration game with dark colors. What I mean by scary design would be something unnerving to do, like in Turok's platforming segments or just playing Superman 64. There aren't many moments in either game where I was tense because of design, but through the way the games present themselves, they are able to create scary experiences, which is, I guess, the way you gotta do it, especially if you're dealing with big, tough boys like me. First, I'll talk about Shadow Man. How does this game use its presentation to scare the player? Well, as far as presentation goes, it doesn't do too much. Why am I making this video? I realized that in Shadow Man there are 2 places in particular which are presented in a scary fashion. The playrooms in the area where you meet Avery are the scariest parts in the game. In the playrooms there is very grotesque imagery, especially in contrast to the rest of the game. But even more so, the music here is terrifying. It's so subtle in its presentation with light, innocent chimes and then a slight scream, and children laughing. Oh, it's so unsettling. I generally don't get creeped out by video games, but this was one of the first times ever when I felt genuine fear. And Avery's area is scary because of this scene in particular. It comes from out of nowhere. This level is very desolate, almost nothing here, and slowly as you progress, you'll be put into narrow corridors. The player is lured into a false sense of security. No enemies, the music is subtle, and boom, jump scare. That it. Other than those 2 examples and a very unsettling end boss fight, there's not much else. There's not a lot of music in Shadow Man, so most of the sounds that you hear are enemy cries and the running noises from Shadow Man, and I think that this kind of silence adds to the scariness. I'm so used to playing games that constantly have music, whether it be in your face or ambient, so when I play a portion in a game where there's no music, it freaks me out. One of the final areas in the game is very dark, but I don't find dark areas in games scary. I think they're annoying. The enemies in Shadow Man are scary though. They're very grotesque and pretty detailed. The fact that you can make out what these enemies look like is beneficial to the game. Also, the N64 version is a bit ugly, which I think helps. It's beneficial that they're detailed enough to be grotesque, but the ugliness of the N64 really helps make them even more unsettling. Hard to explain. How about Nightmare Creatures? The first 3 minutes are so hard to get through. I think that out of the N64 games that I've played up to this point of writing the script, Nightmare Creatures is the most immediately terrifying. With this opening scene of the creatures fighting each other, it was unsettling. Yep, I still hate it. Then there's this title screen and its terrible sounding monster cries. And even in the first level, there's this jump scare that you can totally see coming, but for some reason, it's still scary. When it comes to how it's terrifying, it's pretty in your face. That said, it does have its more subtle moments of terror. For example, when there are enemies nearby, they will screech off screen. If you've encountered an enemy that you've had trouble with and you memorize what noise they make, then hearing the noise from afar builds tension. And there are a lot of enemies in this game that one could struggle with. But from a child's perspective, Nightmare Creatures has visually terrifying enemies. For example, it's got the werewolf, this scary thing, whatever this is, and guys in top hats. And let's be 100% honest, can you trust a person in a top hat? Can you trust anyone in a hat that isn't a baseball hat specifically? I can't. There's this kind of hat, it's not the 20s anymore. Move on. I especially can't trust someone who wears a fedora, not because they're weird and that person probably doesn't shower, but why pick a hat like that? And even more so, someone who knows the difference between a fedora and a trilby has no right to my trust. If you know the difference, then you cannot be trusted. And don't even get me started on cowboy hats. People in cowboy hats... The draw distance being turned into fog is also really smart as it sets a wonderful atmosphere. Nightmare Creatures is one of the best games at utilizing draw distance. There aren't enemies that can hurt you from afar that I can think of, but it does hide them. Also, the game is just foggy in general, so the draw distance mixes with the fog that the developers created. Good fog sets the mood. Bad fog is used to get in cheap shots. I'm never letting it go. The music too is fairly simple. A lot of the focus of the game is on the beat 'em up aspect, but when the sound effects and such go quiet, the music is haunting. I actually can't say much about the music. When the music stands out in Nightmare Creatures, I think it's detrimental to the horror elements of the game. This boss fight in particular. During the levels, it's very low key, but it definitely has that horror vibe to it. And I know that this video's focus is on presentation, but there's a design factor to Nightmare Creatures that makes it unscary potentially. So there's this blue bar on the left, which is your stamina bar. How do you fill the stamina bar up? You gotta fight enemies. But there's an option to remove the stamina bar, so then you could potentially just run through the whole level, which removes any and all tension from the game. Play it right, people. Just wanted to throw this out there real quick like. So what am I trying to say here? Which game is scarier? Which game has the high spookums? Are they even scary at all? From my experience, Nightmare Creature starts off real scary, but becomes a pretty normal beat 'em up as it goes on, so it kinda loses that scariness. Shadow Man starts off relatively tame, but as it moves forward, the imagery, bosses, and music sort of combine to make a relatively scary game. Also, its ending boss fight is pretty terrifying, whereas the ending fight in Nightmare Creatures feels like just another fight. But I also wanted to point out that altogether, I don't find either game too terrifying. I just think that they're solid games for what they were trying to do. In my last video, I said I wasn't sure if I wanted to always do a conclusion to pick a better game, and I was saying that with this video in mind. Conker's vs. Mario, I discussed design, so picking a winner was easy. In this video, I talked about how pretty they were, so it's a bit harder to reach that conclusion. However, if I had to pick a better game, it'd be Shadow Man. It's so good. Nightmare Creatures is an enjoyable experience, but being a beat 'em up and an easy beat 'em up at that, it offers a good time, but it doesn't seem to try anything special. The horror skin really helps to make it stand out though. Shadow Man is good even without having to be scary. It's got excellent design all the way through, and it's something that someone can just get lost in. I reviewed these games a while back, and if you want to see my complete thoughts on them, links will be at the end of the video. I think if you watch those videos, you'll understand my reasoning a bit more. And there it was, Nightmare Creatures versus Shadow Man. If you've played both, let me know which one you think is better. And what N64 game do you think is the scariest? I don't know if you know this, but I only do N64 games. Name one Sonic game on the N64. Well, that was the weirdest thing I've ever done. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This was edited by my good friend Indie Butterknife. A huge thank you for doing this. Go check him out. If you need more FreeXax though, I'll leave links here for my Nightmare Creatures and Shadow Man reviews. They're old, but not terrible. Go check them out. Thanks for watching. Until next time.